I was standing in the fluorescent-lit hallway of the Golden Pines assisted living facility. The social worker had just told me my grandfather had passed quietly in his sleep that morning. I hadn't seen him in 7 years because my mother said he abandoned us for his new wife. I didn't cry at first because I didn't know how to mourn a man I'd been taught to forget. Then the roommate shuffled out of room 214 holding a faded metal lockbox with both hands. He was a wispy old man named Arthur who wore suspenders every single day without fail. He pressed the box into my hands and said, "Your grandfather told me to give you this today. This isn't the story you think it is about a secret fortune or a dramatic final letter. It's not a revenge plot against my mother for keeping us apart for all those long years. And it's certainly not some Hallmark moment where I suddenly realized he was a millionaire. The real story is about the quietest kind of love there is, and I almost missed it completely. If you have ever felt like someone in your family decided you weren't worth keeping, subscribe." My name is Daniel Reeves, and I was 43 years old when Arthur handed me that box. I worked as a high school history teacher in Lansing, Michigan, making $47,000 a year. My life was modest and predictable, and I shared an apartment with my 13-year-old daughter. My mother had told me my grandfather Walter was a selfish man who ran off with a younger woman. My grandmother died when I was 16, and I remember the funeral being unnervingly small. Only 6 people showed up, and my mother stood at the grave with her jaw clenched like granite. She told me my grandfather didn't bother coming, and that proved exactly what kind of man he was. I carried that story inside me like a stone for 27 years without ever questioning it. My mother remarried a man named Gerald who managed a car dealership in the next county over. Gerald always treated me with a cool politeness that felt more like surveillance than real warmth. He asked about my salary once at Thanksgiving dinner and then laughed at the number in front of everyone. My mother laughed too and said I got my lack of ambition from my father's side of the family. I drove home that night with Emma asleep in the back seat and tears freezing on my tired cheeks. I told myself that my mother just had high standards and I'd never deserved her approval anyway. I called her on the first of every month, and she always asked if I'd considered applying at the dealership. I said I was happy teaching, and she said happy wasn't the same thing as successful in her book. I let that wound sit there because I didn't know how to fight back without destroying what was left. Then I heard from a cousin that my grandfather had been placed in a home up near Traverse City. My mother didn't even mention it when we spoke, and she acted surprised when I brought up his name. She said he wasn't our concern anymore, and that he had made his choice decades ago without us. I should have driven up there, but I didn't because I was afraid of what I might actually discover. I was afraid I'd walk in and see a happy old man who just didn't want me around his new life. I was afraid of confirming that I was as forgettable as my mother always made me feel inside. Years passed, and my daughter grew taller, and I graded papers and mowed the lawn every single Saturday. I got a small raise and a new used Honda Civic that smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke. My mother's voice on the phone grew more distant, and she called less frequently as the months went by. I accepted that I was the kind of man people forgot about, and I made peace with that quietly inside. Then the call came from Golden Pines at 8:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in September of the year 2023. The social worker said my grandfather had passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 89. She said he had been a resident for 6 years, and that his roommate Arthur had asked to speak with me. I made the 3-hour drive in silence with nothing but my own heartbeat echoing in the empty car. Arthur was sitting in a vinyl chair with his hands folded, and his eyes were unnervingly clear and bright. He said your grandfather never stopped talking about you, and he showed me your photograph every single day. I felt my chest tighten because I hadn't heard a kind word about myself in what felt like forever. Arthur said your mother told him you didn't want to see him and that you'd moved far away to California. He tried to call you at the number she gave him, and it was disconnected the very next week after that. Your grandfather believed you chose to forget him, and it broke something in his heart that never fully healed. But he kept this box under his bed, and he told me to hold on to it until you finally came to see him. Arthur opened the lockbox slowly, and the hinges groaned like they hadn't been touched in many long years. Inside was a stack of letters that I had written to my grandfather when I was only 11 years old. I remembered writing them because my grandmother told me he was traveling for work and loved receiving mail. I wrote about my baseball games and my grades and how much I missed him at all those family dinners. Every single letter was creased and yellowed, and Arthur said he read them aloud every Christmas without fail. Underneath the letters was a bank statement from a credit union in Traverse City with my full name on it. I stared at the number and felt my knees go weak because it was over $400,000 exactly. Arthur said your grandfather worked as a janitor at the high school for 37 years and saved everything. He lived in a tiny studio apartment and ate canned soup so he could put money away for you and your future. When your grandmother got sick, he paid her medical bills with every single dime he had left in savings. He kept that from your mother because he knew she'd never understand why he gave everything away so freely. Arthur said your mother told him she didn't want his money because it was blood money, as she called it then. She refused to let him speak to you, and she threatened to get a restraining order if he ever tried to call. So he waited all these years, and he made me promise to find you when he was gone and give you this box. I sat there in that chair with Arthur's hand on my shoulder, and I couldn't breathe for a long, heavy moment. I had believed my mother's version of reality for 27 years without ever asking for the other side. I had accepted being unloved because it was easier than fighting for the truth of my own complicated life. And now here was proof that someone had loved me more than I ever allowed myself to imagine or believe. Arthur said your grandfather's final words were, "Tell Danny, I'm sorry the world made him feel so incredibly small." I broke down then in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child with scraped knees on a summer afternoon. My mother had lied not out of malice toward me, but out of pride and control and her own deep unhealed wounds. She had stolen the relationship I could have had with a man who was quietly heroic in his own humble way. But here's the part of this story that really matters, because it's not about revenge against my mother at all. I could have driven straight to her house with that bank statement and thrown it in her face with fury. I could have told her she was wrong and cruel and that I was never going to speak to her ever again. I could have let that righteous anger burn everything down because I had every right to be completely furious. But I looked at Arthur and I realized my grandfather never once tried to humiliate anyone in his entire life. He stayed silent, and he saved, and he loved me from a distance without ever demanding to be seen or acknowledged. He understood that quiet proof outlasts loud cruelty, and that love doesn't need an audience to be completely real. So I went home, and I called my mother, and I told her I knew everything about my grandfather and his savings. She was quiet on the other end of the line, and then she said she only wanted to protect me from the truth. I said, I know you did, but I need you to hear that keeping us apart was a choice you made every single day. I didn't scream, and I didn't threaten to cut her off, because that's not what my grandfather would have ever done. I simply said I'm going to use this money to put Emma through college and buy a house near the riverbank. And I'm going to tell her about her great-grandfather, who was a janitor who saved everything for her future. My mother said nothing, and then she started to cry. And I let her because I know she's human and broken too. I forgave her not because she deserved it, but because I realized carrying that anger was the same trap she fell into. Silence is not the same as absence of love, and being underestimated is not the same as being weak or worthless. I think about Arthur sometimes and the way he held that box like it was made of solid gold in his hands. He stayed loyal to a promise made to a dying man who just wanted his grandson to finally know the entire truth. I have his picture on my dresser now, and I tell Emma about him every week, even though she never got to meet him. I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about the answer before you dismiss it too quickly. Who in your life have you quietly decided doesn't love you without ever asking for the whole complete story? And what would you do if you found out tomorrow that you've been wrong all this time about someone you love? If you believe that some loves work in silence and never demand recognition, then please subscribe to this channel. Because the quiet ones are the ones that hold us up long after the loud ones have faded away entirely forever.